You're listening to Shine On Policycast, SolarPower Europe's podcast that brings you EU solar policy updates in 10 minutes or less. I'm your host, Bethany Meban, Head of Press and Policy Comms at SolarPower Europe. You can find me on Twitter at SolarPowerBeth. And today we're joined by Jan Osenberg, Policy Advisor at SolarPower Europe, who can be found on Twitter at Osenberg_Jan. Okay. Welcome back to Policycast, Jan. I think last time we had you, it was on EPBD, and we hadn't had our upgrade yet on the mics. But this week we'll talk about a different policy file, so the market design revision that came in March, and specifically how it relates to energy sharing. So yeah, tell us a little bit about this energy sharing concept. It's new in terms of EU level legislation. And how is it different from existing models like energy communities? And why is it so great?
Okay, thanks a lot, Bethany. So the energy sharing concept is actually quite the foundation of what we usually call the decentralized electricity system, the things that you always see with the cool graphics, with the cars charging when the sun is shining from different buildings. And that's a little bit the foundation for all this. And the core of this concept is that you and I can soon trade electricity with each other. So when your solar panel generates, you can sell it to me against a price. And we can do this either bilaterally or with a platform, or you can have like online platforms that facilitate this. So that's the core idea of this. But of course, you can also have a big supermarket which has a rooftop system, roof solar system on the roof, to sell to both of us, which would also be possible.
Right. So it means that if I don't have solar panels, I can still buy solar electricity.
That's right. That's right. Exactly that, yeah.
And presumably cheaper than the market rate.
Absolutely. So it's already implemented in Portugal and in France. Those are the two front-runner countries. And experience shows that the rates are, let's say, 60 to 70% of the market rate.
Oh, nice.
But it can be anything between the wholesale market price and the supplier rate, which would be the price where it actually makes sense to trade energy. Above the supplier rate, nobody would buy it. Below the wholesale market price, you wouldn't sell it, but you would sell to the wholesale market.
Oh, okay. And then just if we go back a little bit, how does that relate to the existing structures like energy communities? Because they can complement one another, but they're different.
Yes, exactly. So energy sharing can be used inside energy communities, but the main difference is that energy communities are an organizational concept, and energy sharing is an activity. So what this means is, in energy sharing, you have to set up an organization. Everybody has to have certain rights to contribute to the decisions. There are some voting rules, but also ownership rules, which makes it a very democratic organization, but at the same time, it's very difficult to handle. And we have already seen countries like in the Netherlands where you have reached a saturation point on energy communities, and actually it's only a minority of the citizens. So with energy sharing, we really hope to reach all citizens because it's very simple. You sign a contract and it's done.
Oh, that's great. And you mentioned France and Portugal. So, I mean, this happening in a couple of member states. I mean, what can we learn from their experiences and how's that working out for them?
So, yes, what we see, France, Portugal, Spain, Belgium are the four countries which have kind of implemented it. And what we see in Spain is it only works if you allow third companies to manage the scheme. They take care of the permitting, they take care of the communication with the grid operator, they make sure to match the producers with the receivers. So that's really a key component. And then we see what we can learn from them is how to integrate it with the grid operators and the electricity suppliers, because it actually changes the operation for the grid operators. The grid operators will, what they essentially do is, based on a sharing coefficient, which we have agreed upon, they, on a piece of paper, allocate the volumes that have been produced by my solar panels to your consumption point. So it's basically a virtual calculation where they add my generation to your consumption.
Right.
And that's the first thing. That's, of course, a piece of technical infrastructure that has to be implemented and where you can get best practices. And the second thing is suppliers, how suppliers integrate this into their portfolio. Because usually you have one electricity supplier at one connection point. And what they do is they nominate a certain value which they will provide to you. And then they kind of have to balance for fluctuations such as when you consume less than expected, or when you have solar panels which generate, which they didn't expect, or when you participate in some kind of aggregation scheme. So they kind of have to balance all of this. And now with energy sharing, there's an additional source of fluctuation in there, which can be compared to self-consumption, but only at a different building.
Okay.
So this is also a technical process that we can learn from Portugal and France to integrate it in other countries.
And you mentioned kind of the role of the grid operator here, and it's interesting to come back to because what's the kind of impact of energy sharing on the grid?
Mm-hmm. So in general, without further specifying, there's no impact on the grid. No, you can really say that. Let's say unless it's within the same bidding zone. This is, but then we're talking about different technicalities which would make trading between different bidding zones more complicated. But let's say we keep it to the bidding zone. And the reason is that it's only a virtual calculation. So my solar panels would still feed in the same way than they do if we had no sharing concept. But, and now is the but, if we live in the same district and in the same, let's say in the same region where we are neighbors, then because there is a price difference, the energy that is shared is cheaper than the supplier electricity. You actually have an incentive to consume right at the same time when my solar panels produce. And that basically means that the electrons only flow directly between us, meaning that they don't penetrate the higher grid levels.
Okay. The distribution don't get to the transmission grid.
Exactly that. And here, of course, you have lower costs. Sometimes you have grid congestion on the higher grid levels. And you save basically on the electricity grid infrastructure.
So good for people, good for grids.
That's it.
So you recently had a paper on I think it was originally called collective self-consumption, and now we've rebranded it to energy sharing. If you were to give us kind of 3 key takeaways from that paper, what would it be?
I think most relevant at the moment with the revision of the electricity market design, the first key takeaway is you need certain dedicated grid tariffs, how we call them, to make sure that you have an incentive to consume locally and to actually have a benefit for the electricity grid. Without these grid tariffs, we could just live far away and there's no incentive. Second point is we should have large companies participating also as consumers of electricity, so that you and I could also sell our electricity when we are here at work at SolarPower Europe. We could sell our electricity to the companies, for example, like a supermarket. And that means that we have a good off-taker for our electricity. So that's the second point. And the third point is we believe there should be a threshold. Not all power plants should be able to participate, but only power plants below a certain level. And we say power plants below like 5 to 10 megawatts should be allowed to participate in energy sharing. The ones above should still sell their electricity via the wholesale markets, via the PPAs or the contracts for difference. And the reason is really that first, we want to give an incentive to use rooftop and artificial structure with no environmental impact to energy sharing, because otherwise the utility scale plants are so much cheaper, they would just push out all the rooftop solar from the market, which is not what we want. We want to have the low environmental impact and want the high citizen support solar to be used first. And that's the first point. And the second one is it could become an incentive for utilities to use energy sharing to circumvent the electricity markets, to circumvent the supply.
It gets very messy very quickly.
So we set the threshold at 5 to 10 megawatts.
That makes sense. Okay, so those are some of your recommendations in the paper, and you can check that out on the SolarPower Europe website. But then if there's one kind of key takeaway from the concept of energy sharing and why we need to get it right in the market design, what would it be?
Yeah, I think the especially in the context of the market design, the main benefit is that it's meant to protect citizens from wholesale market prices. We've seen in the energy crisis that electricity prices just went out the roof, and solar energy or wind energy used in energy sharing is not coupled to wholesale market prices, so it provides a really steady price, which is a good opportunity to protect citizens from any external shocks and high prices.
Oh, great. So helps you protect yourself from volatility. It's another reason why we should push through the market design. But then speaking of market design, what about the political process and on getting it on board? Will that be volatile?
Let's hope it's going to be not that volatile and straightforward, but usually it's not, right?
We'll get through trilogues and they'll bring it all back now.
Yeah, so Parliament and Council are already finalizing their positions. I'd say by end of June, maybe early July, both of them will have their positions. And then the trilogues start after summer, and they will finalize by December, so end of the year, roundabout. And that means we have a law at the end of the year, and probably, let's say now 2023, at the end of 2025, this should be in place in all European member states.
Oh, and then energy sharing will really take off. That's some good news. But thanks so much for your insights today, Jan, and maybe we'll have you back on Policycast soon to talk more about energy sharing and citizens and solar. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening to Shine On Policycast. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to share on social media, tagging @SolarPower EU.